On to our final speaker for the night, Dr. Amita Sehgal. She is an HHMI investigator and the John Herr Mercer Professor of Neuroscience here at the School of Medicine. After getting both her bachelor's and her master's degree in India, she matriculated at Cornell University for graduate school, where her PhD work focused on cell biology and genetics. During her postdoctoral training at the Rockefeller University in New York with Dr. Michael Young, she began studying the genetics underlying circadian rhythms. Her research focuses on circadian rhythms that govern many physiological processes, including sleep. She's also interested in understanding the why and how we need to sleep. Her work has been featured in many top-tier journals, as well as in the popular media, including WHYY, Nova, the BBC, New York Times, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Please welcome Dr. Amita Sehgal.
Thank you, Leo. So first, I'd like to thank the students for inviting me to speak here. It's really great to be here. You know, students may not know this, but an invite from students is really a great honor. Yeah, it really means a lot to us. So the other thing I should say is that I thought I was going to be talking to a non-science audience. Now, I look around and see that that's not quite the case. But, you know, so I apologize if my talk is oversimplified. On the other hand, given that I stand in between you and food and alcohol, maybe you'll be happy to have a talk that's not, you know, very science heavy. So in fact, I'm not really talking about our own data at all. It's really more about the field we work in. So what you're looking at here in my first slide is Earth's day-night cycle seen from the moon. Is this point? Oh, there we go, okay. So it's Earth's day-night cycle seen from the moon. So the point here basically to be made is that we live in a cyclic environment. And to adapt to the cyclic environment, our bodies time a lot of our behavior and physiology so that it occurs with a rhythm that's, you know, synchronized to this environment. And the best known example of such a rhythm is sleep. So sleep is a behavioral state that's seen in many different species, just some of which are shown here. Now, so sleep is an example of a circadian rhythm. Circadian, by the way, means about a day, about 24 hours, and that, of course, is true for sleep. But it is also true for many, many other body processes. So it turns out that body temperature, blood pressure, hormone secretion, a lot of metabolism, cholesterol metabolism, glucose metabolism, they all occur with a 24-hour rhythm. And I should stress that these are just a very, very partial listing of body functions that occur with a rhythm. In fact, these days, quite honestly, it's hard to find some aspect of physiology that does not, on some level, show a circadian or 24-hour component to it. Now, these rhythms are controlled by clocks that are within us. Okay, so circadian clocks, in a nutshell, are found everywhere. The best known clocks are the ones, or clock is in the brain over here that synchronizes to the day-night cycle and drives sleep-wake. But there's a clock in the lungs, in the liver, in the gut. And so a lot of these processes that I mentioned to you, like, you know, metabolic activity, would be controlled by a local clock in the relevant tissue. So the clock in the liver, for instance, would drive a cycle of cholesterol metabolism and glucose metabolism. Okay, so most of the time, you know, you might be like, okay, so there are clocks and a lot of my body, you know, physiology is rhythmic, but so what? Why do I really care about this? Now, there are times when you become acutely aware of these clocks within us. And of course, one of those instances is when you are, you know, defying your internal clock and doing something that doesn't agree with it, such as traveling to a different time zone. So when you travel from one time zone to another, I think, most people here might have experienced some form of jet lag, and that occurs because your body rhythms are synchronized to the environment that you came from, the day-night cycle. And so when you move to a different day-night cycle, it takes a while to adjust. So jet lag is definitely one of the scenarios in which you become aware of your body clocks. Now, it turns out that even though everybody has clocks and everybody, has rhythms of behavior and physiology that are timed, the exact timing could be a little different from individual to individual. So we're all familiar with the idea that people are most functional at different times of day, okay? They have their internal physiology makes them different in that sense. So, some people are bright and alert in the morning, and then others are not really fully awake until noon, okay? Now, in the circadian field, we call them owls or larks. And just a little tidbit of information here, we now know how these clocks are generated within organisms. I'm not going into the details here right now. Like I said, again, in the interest of keeping this simple, I chose to not do that. But there are specific mechanisms, specific genes that account for this 24-hour rhythm. And one of the areas that circadian researchers are investigating is what it is that makes people owl or larks. Are there polymorphisms in these so-called clock genes? Now, not only does the timing of these vary from one person to another, but also over the course of your lifespan, the timing of your rhythms can change. So, adolescents are usually delayed in their circadian rhythms. Those of you who have teenagers at home will know that they do not wake up in the morning very, easily. And older people tend to be early. But so this thing with the adolescents in particular is interesting because it turns out that even though their internal rhythms are delayed, they are forced into schedules in daily life that go against their internal rhythms. And what I'm referring to then is the fact that high schools start earlier in the day than middle schools, which start earlier than elementary school. And really, the internal rhythms are going in the opposite direction. So, the really young kids are waking up early, and yet they wait to go to school. And there's actually people who are putting a lot of effort. So one of these people is listed here. Mary Carskadden is a professor at Brown University who's basically devoted her life to trying to change, deal with the education boards and change the timings of schools so that they're more compatible with people's internal rhythms. And it's not working because of economics. Everything always comes down to money. Okay, so as I said, in adolescence, rhythms are delayed. In young kids, they're early. In older people, again, you might have noticed that rhythms are early, okay? They tend to wake up early. Now, the other thing that happens with age is that the cycles deteriorate. So here you're looking at an activity profile of a young subject over a 5-day period. And so here's activity, and the space in between here represents bouts of sleep. So it's a robust rhythm. Now here you're looking at an older subject, and what you see is that the nighttime sleep bouts are interspersed with activity. So there are nighttime awakenings here. And then in the daytime, you start to see a lot of naps. Now, interestingly, all animals display the same change in behavior with age. So we, in my lab, work with fruit flies. And here, so the great thing about the flies is that you can look at the same fly, young and old, as opposed to the humans, where, of course, you can't do that. So here's an activity record. This is actually the only piece of data I'm showing. Here's an activity record from a young fly. So this particular, the way it's plotted is that the shaded areas correspond to activity. Flies are diurnal, so they're active during the day. The day-night cycle is indicated on the top. And each line here is 48 hours or 2 days. So you see that this young fly has this very, very robust pattern of activity. Now here is the same fly when she's old, and I think it's pretty obvious that this rhythm has fallen apart. One of the things that we're doing in the lab is trying to figure out why it is that this happens. What are the molecular mechanisms that account for this change? Okay, so what I told you is that rhythms are different from person to person. They also change at different stages of your life, but they also change because of stuff that we do to them in modern lifestyles. So typically, the clock in the brain is synchronized to the day-night cycle, okay? And if you're on a good day-night cycle, the clock in the brain is going to be driving sleep at the right time. However, in modern society, we expose ourselves to light at random times. And that actually is not so great because now the clock in the brain, which is driving sleep-wake, is kind of messed up. Okay, and the clock in the brain is really what's synchronizing all the other body clocks to the day-night cycle. Now, it turns out that the other body clocks are sensitive not just to the signals they get from the brain with respect to day-night, they're also sensitive to other signals. So the clock in the liver, for instance, is really very sensitive to the time of feeding. More so even than to the signals about day-night that it's getting from the brain clock. So if you are on a normal day-night cycle and your brain clock is nicely synchronized to that day-night cycle, but you're eating at the wrong time of day, so let's say your food intake is occurring late at night, then what's going to happen is that that liver clock is now going to be set by the timing of the food intake. And in that scenario, then, these two clocks are not in synchrony anymore. And that's really bad. Okay, because in the animal studies, so in rats, when that's done, and you can experimentally do this, when you do that in rats, the rats become obese. And when we do this in flies, we find that reproductive fitness is compromised. So they lay fewer eggs and are less fertile. So for optimal function of this whole system, you need to have the clock synchronized with each other and also well synchronized to the environment. Okay, so in the last few minutes, what I'd like to do is, I've been telling you about rhythms, and what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes on one of these rhythms, and that is the one that I started with, which is the sleep rhythm. Now, sleep occurs with a 24-hour rhythm. However, if you did not have any clocks to drive a 24-hour rhythm of sleep, you would still sleep. Okay, it just would occur randomly across the day-night cycle. It wouldn't have this periodicity, but you would still sleep. And that is because sleep is essential, and so we must sleep. And there is another system in place, which is termed the homeostatic system, that determines sleep amount and intensity, and this system ensures that you get enough sleep. So this system can often defy the circadian system. So if you've been up all night, in the morning your circadian clock is telling you to wake up, but the homeostatic system is saying you haven't slept, you need to catch up on your sleep. And then you undergo what we in the sleep field call the sleep rebound. And this system we actually understand very little about. Okay, the circadian clock, I told you we actually have molecular mechanisms and so forth at this point. What is really comprises the homeostatic system is very poorly understood. It also, though, changes with age. So again, this is also a kind of plasticity, right? It's behaviors that are changing across lifespan. So young animals sleep a lot, and that's true pretty much universally. And here, like in humans, are the average, number of hours that you sleep at different stages of life. And so the young, again here, sleep a lot. And I should mention here, as Leo introduced the whole ocular dominance model of plasticity in the cats that was done by Torsten Riesel, I just wanted to point out that it turns out that sleep is required for that plasticity. And that actually was shown by Marcos Frank, who used to be a faculty member here until recently, but has now moved to Washington State. Marcos, when he was a postdoc, showed that sleep was required for that particular plasticity. And we found in some very recent work done by Matt Kaiser in my lab that in very young fruit flies, which sleep a lot, the sleep is required for development of the nervous system. And it's required for development of circuitry that drives behaviors later in life. In fact, Matt has this hypothesis that sleep disruption in early life makes you more susceptible to neuropsychiatric disorders as an adult. And these animal data that we have thus far are supporting the idea that behaviors later are impacted. Okay, so what happens if you deprive adults of sleep? You get, so I talked about sleep early being important for development and for the ocular dominance plasticity. David Dinger's lab here at Penn does a lot of studies showing that loss of sleep leads to cognitive impairment, attention lapses, and others have looked at the effects of sleep loss on the immune system, on metabolism, and the bottom line is that this is not just affecting brain function, it's really affecting body physiology. All right, I will stop there and be happy to take questions then. Thank you. Yeah.
What, if any, research has been done on the effect of, shift workers like nurses or doctors who are working overnight?
Yeah, no, great question. Right, so they have serious health problems, okay, a lot of them, and pretty much in every system. There's increased cancer, increased cardiovascular abnormalities. What's not clear in a lot of cases, in case of the shift work studies, but even others, is whether all of these occur because of the circadian desynchrony, they're working against the natural environment, or whether it's because of sleep deprivation. Because most of them also are not sleeping enough because they're forced to sleep at the wrong time. So those things are always a little bit difficult to tease apart.
Have there been any studies on deep sea creatures to see if they have a circadian rhythm or if they a lack of one?
There haven't been too many studies on deep sea creatures. There have been some studies done on blind moles, some of which don't seem to have, active circadian clocks. But offhand, I can't recall on the deep sea creatures.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have there been any studies done with forcing people to adapt to an extended day length, in a case that one might experience if in some future time humans traveled to another planet that had a different day length?
Oh, I see what you're talking about. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the circadian system basically can, so we can do these experiments with animals, all right? I don't think they've ever been done with humans, but in the animal models, you can put them in what we call an altered T cycle. Okay, so instead of a 24-hour cycle, you can put them on a 30-hour cycle, you can put them on a shorter cycle, and so forth. And what happens is that there is a limit to entrainability of the clock. So if it's a few hours here and there, the clock will adapt to it. If it's dramatically different, then what happens is that they start to what we call free run. So they behave like they would in constant darkness, where they're not seeing the signal outside, they're just going with the internal clock. I should mention too that the internal clocks are not usually strictly 24 hours. Humans are a little bit longer, and flies are a little bit shorter. But yeah, so they start to free run, they don't adapt anymore. So I think space travel is going to be problematic. Yeah?
When should you eat, or how should you eat in order to properly set your liver clock?
Yeah, so it should be, for a diurnal animal, it should be during daytime hours. Because, you're sleeping at night, and so the liver clock is getting the signal that, you know, this is nighttime and this is day, and during the daytime is when the animal is active, and so it should be daytime hours. There are actually people doing work. We've done some of these in flies, and I have a friend who's doing this in mice. Actually, he's doing human studies too, where they're looking at the effects of time-restricted feeding on metabolism and physiology, okay? So basically what we find is that if you, like I said, feeding will entrain the liver clock. So if you feed them at the wrong time, it's going wrong. But if you feed animals at the exact right time, you know, and instead of just letting them have food all the time, like if you just restrict their food to daytime hours, then you make the circadian cycling stronger. It's all in synchrony and it's stronger, okay? And that turns out to be quite beneficial for health. And my friend Sachin Panda, who actually gave a talk here last week in the pharmacology department, what he finds is that what he's testing is the idea that instead of restricting calories that you take in, which is always hard to do, you can actually promote, you know, weight loss and a healthy living by restricting the time. And what he finds is that within that period of time, if you do it at the correct time, even if you have the same caloric intake, you're better off. Yeah.
Have there been any studies about segmented sleep?
I'm sorry, about what?
About segmented sleep as far as breaking up your sleep cycle.
Oh, you mean like, yeah, okay, segmented or fragmented, yeah, yeah.
Historically, like 2 separate sleeps as far as like right around, like in the early evening, and then waking up for maybe 4 hours and going back to sleep around midnight and then waking up again. Do you know of any studies that...
So nobody's tried to do that in the lab, but it turns out that people have done research on like tribal populations in South America, for the most part, I think. And those people, because they don't have electricity, they're driven by the light-dark cycle. And you know, they're close to the equator, so it's roughly 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark. Now, they're not sleeping 12 hours of dark, because, you know, it's way more sleep than they need. So it was actually published in the New York Times, my source of information for a lot of science, I might add. But they found that the people, you know, sleep in the early evening and do exactly what you're saying. They go to sleep when the sun sets, they don't have any electricity, but then they wake up in the middle of the night and they talk, they might do, you know, small little tasks, and then they go back to sleep. As to whether that would be an optimal lifestyle for, you know, modern society, I think it will be difficult to adopt it. Yeah.
I have a question related to food and the diet. Like for patients who are diabetics, where they're more, feeding is actually far more controlled, do you see a difference in the two clocks being desynchronized, and what do you do for people like that?
For people who are diabetic, are the clocks desynchronized? I'm sorry, is that what you asked?
Yeah, and if they are, what can you do, because their feeding is so sensitive?
Right. So I don't think that, you know, I mean, obviously these things are difficult to do in people to figure out whether the clocks are in synchrony or not. So I think the answer to that question is I don't know. But in general, is diabetes related to loss of circadian function? The thinking is that there is a connection. So clock mutants, some of them show a higher susceptibility to you know, hyperglycemia and diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and you know, vice versa. People with diabetes, there are reports of disrupted sleep-wake cycles. So, and we do know that there is a clock in the pancreas, and that secretion of insulin is rhythmic.
We're going to have to stop questions for now, but feel free to ask questions at the reception. But round of applause for Dr. Sehgal. Just a few quick thank yous before we go out to the reception out in the hall where there's food and wine. We'd like to thank the Mahoney Institute for Neurosciences for generously supporting this event. And special thanks go to Jackie Folks, Josh Gold, Jane Hoshi, Kelly Jordan Chudo, and the other people that really helped out with this. And a special thank you to Dave Reiner, who is the chair of the Public Lecture Planning Committee. And thank you all for coming. So please come out and enjoy some food.